All right, Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in Sweden. A lot to unpack here. We could talk a little bit about their COOF policy, how it's been changing, and they have gotten a lot stricter there. And I say that we could talk about it because it seems that there may be some correlation with very high spikes in shootings and crime, especially in Stockholm, which has got the authorities in Sweden kind of, I don't want to say, puzzled, but previously much of the violence was situated in Malmo, and recent studies that have come out, recent statistics that have come out suggest that the violence in Malmo has dissipated a little bit, the gang violence, but we've seen a huge spike. And let me get the number for you from RT. It says 79% increasing in shootings in 2020, 79% spike in shootings as the government laments high level of violence in the Scandinavian country. That's out of RT. Obviously, there's without a doubt immigration issues there, and there's a lot of gang violence, and a lot of the violent events that are taking place are gun shootings, but also a lot of knife violence as well. And I know that London also had some issues with knife violence. I don't know if they're still prevalent, but
Absolutely.
I mean, what's going on here?
I mean, can I just say we absolutely have knife violence in Britain, and there was a particularly gruesome incident in which a young man was killed about 100 yards from where I live in London, and this is an affluent area, so we have it in London, but not on the scale that they seem to have in Sweden, where it has exploded. And of course, Sweden historically was an extremely orderly and law-abiding place. I mean, I can remember my parents who visited Sweden in the 60s commenting upon the fact my aunt who knew the Swedish Prime Minister at that time, Tage Erlander, was, I remember her telling me how he told her what an orderly place Sweden was. And that was the history that most Swedes remember. This very orderly, law-abiding place that Sweden used to be. And now, of course, it is not any longer. There's violent crime in Stockholm. There's violent crime in Malmo, even if that's diminished a little. Urban centres in Sweden are now apparently facing a large epidemic of gun crime and knife crime. And, of course, there are also no-go areas. But what is really interesting about all of this, what is really remarkable, is that at the same time as all this is going on, Sweden, the Swedish government, is in large-scale denial about it. They've been trying to deny the fact that this crime is happening, even as this crime wave increases and gets stronger all the time. And, of course, they are refusing really to consider whether some of the reasons behind this crime. And the reason they do this is, again, because this has got all very mixed up with the question of immigration and the fact that many of the people who are perpetrating the crimes are recent immigrant communities which, for all kinds of reasons, have not been fully assimilated into Swedish society. This is a very difficult issue for the Swedish government to address. Swedish government, I would remind our viewers, is a social democratic, left of centre government, very much with the kind of views that we see governments of a similar ideological makeup have around the world. So they are strenuous in denying these kind of connections, but at the same time, by denying those kind of connections, they struggle to accept that these problems of violent crime that are now exist in Sweden do exist, and at the same time they are failing to address those problems, because if you recognise some of the causes or some of the principal causes of those problems, then you can start doing things. You can start looking at your immigration policies. You can start asking questions about why your assimilation policies aren't working. You can work with these communities, as happens in various countries, as in Germany, for example, you might be able over time to work out policies and programs that assist in that process of assimilation and break up the violent gangs that seem to hold many of these communities in their grip and which have created no-go areas across Sweden. But if you take an ideological approach which refuses to see a problem and refuses to look at its cause, then all you are doing is ensuring that you will see these problems get worse. I have to say, I'm going to just throw this in, it seems to me that we see many of the same problems in the United States with the Democrats, in America. There has been a significant spike in crime happening since the summer, and of course the Democrats are again refusing to address that or to discuss its possible causes. And I have to say Sweden looks exactly the same. Britain, perhaps the same too, at least London, where of course London in Sadiq Khan has a mayor with similar kinds of views.
Okay, so you can't chalk this up to being an EU policy thing, I would imagine. No. I mean, maybe you may want to address that as well. Maybe there are some policies that the EU puts on Sweden that has led to this disastrous state that we see Sweden moving into. But Sweden has always been considered historically as a bellwether type of country.
Yes.
It's always kind of led in the trends and been an indicator for other countries of what is to come, big or small. Sweden has always kind of been in the lead as far as how society may end up being, further down the line. And my question is are we seeing that in Sweden today? In other words, and I don't want to just talk about European countries because you mentioned the UK, you mentioned the US. Are what we're seeing in Sweden right now a sign of things to come in the UK, the United States, other countries in the EU, and countries that are not in the EU, And is this has to do more with a social democrat policy, or is this something else? Is this directly tied to migration policy? Is this also correlated to lockdowns? How would you call the situation here? How do you see this thing?
I think lockdowns have undoubtedly played a role in that they've created a sense of frustration amongst a lot of people, especially young people. And they've also set the scene for people to come under severe economic pressure. And that obviously plays a role in all of this. But I would have to say this. The problems in Sweden go back long before the lockdown started, before the present pandemic began. The same is true in Britain. And of course, another country that stands out for this is France, which also has these severe problems. And of course, it has an Islamist terrorist problem, or has had an Islamist terrorist problem, which is connected to all of this. On top of that, France also has its no-go areas, its problems with assimilation. All of the things that we see in Sweden, they also exist in France. What I would say is this is a Western problem. It is very connected with existing social democratic type governance and policies, and the ideology that seems to go with all of those things today, which, by the way, is a globalist ideology, completely contrary to the policies that social democratic parties used to have once upon a time in places like Sweden. I mentioned Tage Erlander earlier because, of course, he was the Prime Minister, the Social Democratic Prime Minister of Sweden from 1946 to 1969. And he used to say, he said many times and in public, that the reason why Sweden has been able to develop the social democratic model, which is so stable and so law orderly and so law abiding, and where crime is so low, is precisely because Sweden is a homogeneous society in which everybody shares the same sort of views and attitudes, and where there is a broad consensus about how a society should be run. That was said by Erlander, if you like, the axiomatic social democrat around the world in those days. Today, social democrats, including in Sweden and in Britain and in France and in the United States and in Germany and in many places, talk a completely different language. So you see how the Social Democrats have changed their views. You see how that makes it more and more difficult for them to address these kinds of problems. And at the same time, you also see that this is not just an EU problem, that the EU is very much accepting of these conceptions, but it's also one that is a problem that is shared by many Western countries. If you go outside the West, if you go to, say, the countries of Asia or the Far East, you'll find that attitudes there are completely different.
All right. How much of a role does NATO and the U.S. war machine play in all of this? And I go back, you said this precedes the pandemic, and I go back to George W. Bush and Barack Obama completely destroying so many countries in the Middle East. And you have, once again, these woke politicians, especially in the case of Barack Obama, who preach about social equity and inclusion and diversity, and they completely destroyed entire countries. Syria, Libya, Iraq, the list goes on and on and on, Somalia, so many countries that they laid waste to. And, Europe had to deal with it because of proximity. I mean, it's just basic geography that much of the population that got completely decimated by NATO and the United States had to find safe harbor somewhere. So how much of all of this social upheaval that you are seeing in Sweden, which was definitely a lot more open than, say, I don't know, a country like Greece, for example. Even though Greece did open its doors, I would say Sweden was a lot more open to many of the people that were fleeing, death and destruction at the hands of NATO and countries like Sweden that partake in all of this stuff. You have to be honest. Whether you're in NATO or not, it was very much a U.S. Europe initiative that destroyed countries, like Libya and Syria and all these countries. They were all in on it. And so I don't know, they destroy these countries in the Middle East, and then they destroy their own countries. It's just so, it doesn't make any sense at all. But how much of the problem do you see in Sweden, and what's going to happen to other countries, what's happening to other countries is the fault of NATO and the war machine?
You put it profoundly right, because if we go back again to the Sweden of the sort of 40s and 50s and 60s, Tage Erlander's Sweden. That Sweden was actually quite welcoming to refugees from various places. There were Greeks, there were Yugoslavs who went there. Germany at that time was taking lots of people from Turkey. People were going to Britain from parts of the former British Empire, but you could assimilate them. They were peaceful people. They were law-abiding. The difference today is that many of these huge waves of people who are coming to Europe are coming from societies which have been completely destroyed because of these wars. And of course, many of these people have become intensely radicalized, and they're bringing their radical ideologies and opinions with them. Of course, it's important to say, some of that radicalization caused and fed into those wars. I don't want to put the entire blame for George W. Bush for the rise in, Al-Qaeda, and that would be an absurd idea. But you can see how all of these things came together and became connected. And then you go in and you smash up these countries, and these people with their radical ideas and their very anti-Western ideas. And when we say anti-Western, I mean their hostility to European cultures and Christianity and the whole European, world culture system, if you like. They've come pouring into Europe, bringing these ideas with them and communicating those sort of ideas to other people within these communities, who, as a result, become radicalized and resistant to assimilation, forming pockets within these countries that become hostile to those countries and express themselves either through violent crime or sometimes, as we've seen in France and to some extent in Germany and in Britain, through acts of actual Islamist terrorism. So all of this goes together. And again, contrast this with social democrats of Erlander's day in Sweden, who were opposed to wars. They opposed regime change wars at that time. They were against things like, the wars in Vietnam, the interventions in the Middle East, and those sort of things. With social democrats nowadays, when they enthusiastically endorse those sorts of wars. Sweden has been actually one of the sort of backers of the US in many of these kinds of adventures. I say the US, we know whom I mean when I mean the US. So we see a reversal. The social democrats today pursue radically different policies, both in terms of throwing open the doors to refugee flows and refusing to look at the problems within their own societies that causes, whilst at the same time supporting the wars, the forever wars, if you like, which create both the radicalization and the regime flows. And you put it exactly right. They shatter other countries and they destabilize their own, and they destabilize their own societies. And then when these problems grow around them, what do they say? Anybody who tries to bring them up, they get called all sorts of names, they face all kinds of problems, and the governments refuse to look at these problems, refuse to address them, won't talk about them, won't come up with solutions to them.
All right, so is Sweden the bellwether globalist society? I mean, I mentioned they're a bellwether.
Yes,
Are they the bellwether globalist society?
I think it is. I think it is. I think it absolutely is. I mean, back in the 60s, Sweden was the ideal that many people aspired to, and of course we saw that the Swedish system, the Swedish welfare state, spread all over the world, or at least spread all over the West. And now we see Sweden again is the absolute avant-garde, at the forefront of the kind of changes that we see around the world. It's opening up its borders, it's in fact erasing its borders, and at the same time it's pursuing a globalist agenda and supporting regime change wars around the world. So we see how Sweden is, in effect, the shape of things to come, if you like. And we see knife crime in Britain. We see more crime in the United States. We see severe problems in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in all sorts of places. And Sweden, again, has taken that further than almost anywhere else. And as we see with social democratic type governments in other places, it refuses to address the existence of those problems.
All right. Okay. We will leave it there. Alexander McCurse, thank you very much, guys. Look for us on Rumble, on Odyssey, and on BitChute. PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar, and Bitcoin. You'll find those links down below. That really helps out the channel a lot when you support us. And go to the Duran shop, pick up some merchandise, like maybe one of our magic mugs or one of our long sleeve shirts.
Absolutely, or our hats and our hoodies and our sweatshirts. You find them all in our shop, and you support us by buying these great things. And of course, please check us out on our other platforms and our other channels, and support us through Patreon and Subscribestar and those things, and of course via Bitcoin too. And please join us for our next program.
All right. Take care, everybody.